So I've been doing a lot of rewatching and rereading on my own time and on YouTube time when it comes to JoJo's, obviously. And when I do, I always find a certain fascination with the JoJo villains. I don't know why, it's just something I like to really dig into for whatever reason. I think the villains of JoJo kind of represent this opposite nature to what JoJo's is for. JoJo's is for the celebration of humanity, but when you look at the villains, that is clearly not the case. What the villains of JoJo symbolize is something I think people don't want to talk about or get scared to talk about because it shows the negative side of humanity, and that's totally honestly fair. What some of these characters do is very terrifying to the average mind. For God's sakes, Kira as a character has a lot of weight behind him that I think a lot of people kind of gloss over, because if you think about it for too long, it will kind of scare the shit out of you. So I totally understand why people don't want to talk about these villains. However, with some very needed discussions coming very soon with Part 7 Steel Ball Run in terms of the anime, I think we need to rip off the band-aid. So I'll be giving my opinions on what these villains symbolize on a personal level and what they possibly mean within the story. And since we don't have a Part 9 villain, I will be trying to figure out at the very end what Araki is trying to say with all these villains all together in unison, because I think it's actually critically important for the story overall for JoJo's and what the celebration of humanity truly means. So with that being said, hello, my name is Metas. Walk with me. So starting in chronological order, let's start with Dio from Part 1, obviously. Now, I think Dio symbolizes kind of a mixture of a few things because it's not as clear-cut as a lot of people make it out to be. Dio poses this question of pure evil, whether it's from birth somebody is born pure evil or is fated to be pure evil, or the environment they are born in. While based off of Victorian-era Dracula, a character who is based off of literal Satan himself and trained under Satan, if you have not read the original book, Dracula is posed to be a creature of pure evil into this world, very similar to Dio. However, Araki kind of does this thing where he poses the question because of Dio's environment, he might have turned out a little bit different. However, other points in the story say that he was fated to be like this from the very start. And with other characters within JoJo having very similar backstories don't turn out to be like Dio, in retrospect, you could say that Dio was born evil. However, I think it's a bit of both. Dio grew up in an environment where in order to survive, you have to beat the other dog. A dog eats dog kind of world. So in order to rise above Jonathan or the Joestar family in general, he has to get rid of them. And the only process he is able to do that through is with the stone mask. However, through the stone mask, the price of that is your humanity, which is a pretty heavy toll. However, almost instantly and without any care, Dio is easily willing to throw away his own humanity for the pursuit of power, without realizing the consequences of it later. Let me rephrase that. Instead of living a hard-working life filled with love and compassion and hope for, your fellow man in order to build a better tomorrow, Dio is willing to throw all of that away for power with some very bad negative consequences associated with it. Now, over the course of this video, Dio's character will evolve, so I will ask you to remember this for later. Overall, what Part 1 Dio symbolizes is that pure evil, regardless of where it comes from, will do evil actions for the sake of one's own selfish desires, whether that be power, fame, or fortune. But Dio got this infamy thanks to the stone mask. So where did the stone mask come from? Well, it came from Kars the Pillarman. So for a very long time, I've had a very complex relationship with Kars the villain for a lot of different reasons, because I never understood what Araki was trying to say through Kars' character. But before recording this, I think I kind of figured it out. Years prior, I've always given Kars this nickname of the origin of evil. However, looking back on to why I gave him that, that nickname, I kind of realized it's more accurate than I originally thought. Comparing him to Part 1 Dio, Kars' actions towards his own species are significantly worse than Dio foregoing his humanity against the Joestars and especially Jonathan. In Kars' pursuit of becoming technically a super Pillarman at first and then wanting to become the ultimate life form because there's more potential in his body to go even further, he loses much more than Dio ever had in the beginning of his own life. Remember, Kars had lived for thousands of years before he actually made the first stone mask and started his journey to find the super Asha stone. Dio, while he did have his humanity, other than that, didn't really have much. So in Kars' pursuit of wanting even more than something even Dio could even ever fathom, lost his friends, his family, his entire civilization, and possibly even more than we don't even realize, all by his own hands. It begs the question, how much of wanting is too much? And clearly for Cars, it wasn't enough, because the rest of the Pillarmen end up either getting contained or dying for this goal. And while yes, Cars does become the ultimate life form, does it even really matter? Because within part 2, and I say overall JoJo's actually, that the ultimate power, or extremely powerful abilities, will never be able to beat dumb luck, aka gravity and fate within JoJo's. So what I think Cars is supposed to symbolize is a cautionary tale of wanting too much. At some point, something has to satisfy you, because eventually you could want the ultimate power, but it's ultimately meaningless in the long run of the universe, as something will come along and check your humility. On top of that, the levels of pure evil do exist. There are things out there in this universe worse than Dio. Crazy to say that, I know, but the reality of it is there are characters within JoJo you could argue as being even worse than pure evil Dio. There's genuine levels to this shit, man, I'm telling you. And speaking on Dio, I think we should move on to part 3 Dio with a little bit of part 6 in there to clear up some very specific points about this version of the character, because I do think he is pretty radically different from the part 1 character that we saw so many years ago. So I think personally, after a character is beaten by the hero, I think rationally is that's when the villain or minor villain kind of understands the clue that, yeah, I was the bad guy, I should probably change my ways. However, we're talking about Dio in this scenario, and instead of Dio doing that, he proceeds to double down and then goes even crazier. I genuinely can't tell if Dio, at the end of part 1 going into part 3, is going through some type of religious experience or is trying to heavily cope by the fact that he lost to Jonathan, somebody who he saw as inferior, then saw somebody as equal, only after getting his ass beat. So equal, in fact, that he only views Jonathan as a prosthetic to keep furthering his own goals as a vampire, while simultaneously coming up with a pretty cope idea that somehow gravity and fate have interlinked their lives. And that's why he lost the first time around, obviously. And then proceeds to be at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years with a new body and a different mindset after his fateful encounter and loss to Jonathan. So what happens to the pure evil vampire that was part 1 Dio? Well, coming out of it into part 3 with a bit of part 6 details in there, Dio comes out of it, well, terrified. I bet you weren't expecting that kind of answer, were you? I wholeheartedly believe that Dio, after the events of part 1, realizes that even though he is a vampire and transcends most creatures on the planet, in comparison to the universe, he is unfathomably weak. While he can't confirm it outright in the moment, or I think possibly ever, we the audience know that even when you transcend all the species on the planet, that being Ultimate Cars, you are still at the whim of the universe, whether it chooses you live or die. And after spending 100 years underwater, Dio knows this for a fact. Part 3 Dio's dialogue is much more articulate compared to his part 1 counterpart. There's almost this air of deep understanding and a lot of knowledge that he's gained either talking to himself or other stand users in order to figure out the gravity and fate of this universe, caused by his near-death experience in part 1. This is ultimately backed up from most of the dialogue him and Pucci share within part 6. In a weird way, I think he did progress in the right direction, like he failed upwards in a weird way, unless there's a star in front of him where then he just completely reverts back to his part 1 counterpart where he just goes full hater mode. Remember, he's still pure evil even after getting punished, but he just thinks a lot more philosophically now. I guess in a very simple way to describe it, I think what Araki is trying to say through part 3 and part 6 Dio is that evil will still be evil even if it's taught a lesson, and will still try to further its goals, maybe even change them up a hell of a lot, because in this case, Dio is trying to figure out how to control fate through the Heaven Plan in order to take over the world or get a better control over the universe that resides by him. Because the fear of death and because of the fear of weakness terrifies Dio to such a degree, the only way to circumnavigate that is in order to control fate. In a way, it's like an old man who's known he's sinned his entire life, knowing that when he dies, he's not going to go to the right place, so he tries to do as much saving for his soul as he can in his final moments. You potentially also see this with the world, as in the Stand, as the tarot card, the world, usually symbolizes somebody who wants to be at the center of basically everything. So that whole wanting to control fate or gravity honestly makes a whole lot of sense when you look at the world and what it means for Dio. Now, taking a quick step back, I think the first 3 parts of Jojo cover a hell of a lot of symbolism when it comes to evil men. There is a lot of wanting and backstabbing, all in the pursuit of, well, like I said, wanting and power, but never taking the time to correct yourself if any of this is worth it or is moral or just. Cause let's be real, both Dio and Cars could have lived very well before they turned the other cheek and massacred whole civilizations and burned family ties. But there is a good side of this. You'll never meet a Dio or Cars in real life because the chances of either of those personalities existing truthfully are slim to none. And then you get to Kira. And not to burst your bubble, but I am, Kira is based off of real life people from the US and Japan. This is the most real a villain will ever get in JoJo's. Yoshikage Kira, before the events of part 4, was, and kind of still during part 4 until the very end, was a very successful serial killer. Unlike the previous villains, Kira was able to enjoy his victories of the hands of women that he killed for a very long period of time. Kira was highly successful in being never caught by the police of Morio, somehow always being multi-steps ahead of anybody who was trying to find him, if they even could find him. Eerily similar to real-life serial killers. But unlike the previous villains, Kira did not want anything more than this, nor any powers. However, he was given those powers through the stand arrow and was given Killer Queen, which made his serial killer lifestyle much easier, as he was basically able to get rid of all evidence thanks to Killer Queen and its bombs. However though, this came with a drastic side effect. Stand users attract other stand users, and Morio is chock full of stand users. So just in a matter of time, Yoshikage Kira would meet another stand user, meaning his serial killer tendencies would have been exposed sometime or another. And that's exactly what happens. Years of being the ghost of Morio, killing innocent women here or there, was finally exposed to the public. All because of the pride and ego he felt with Killer Queen bolstered him so much that he thought he could get away with anything. That wasn't the case. If anything, it got progressively worse. Over time, he tried to use Killer Queen more and more in order to defend himself against these other stand users in Morio. Ironically enough, just like real life serial killers, after going on a hot streak for years, one slip up and it usually leads down a trail that the justice system can find and punish you for it. I believe when Araki was writing Kira, he wanted to tell a cautionary tale of the idea that ego and pride can ruin things for you, good or bad, and repeatedly falling into the ego and pride scenario ultimately leads to failure again and again and again, as there are multiple cases with Kira doing that multiple times and failing always. And the Morio warriors got lucky. If it wasn't for that ego and pride, there is a good chance that Kira would have survived. He would have been able to live in Morio and still cause chaos with his new second identity. Hayato technically really clutched up at the very end of part 4. Sadly though, for most real life cases, there isn't a lot of good endings like this. So I would also say Araki is also trying to symbolize or even give a warning to not trusting everybody you know. Cause sure, Kira is based off of David Bowie, who looks like a pretty okay guy, but behind the character or the person might be something a bit darker that you did not want to interact with in any possible way. Honestly, I think part 4 of JoJo's, when it comes to its villain, is the closest we'll ever get to a possible real-life villain being in JoJo's, and vice versa. At the end of the day, be careful who you talk to. Now, while not as crazy as Kira, I think moving on to Diavolo teaches us a few things. Diavolo is a paranoid mafia boss. Shockingly pretty simple compared to the other villains within JoJo, but that doesn't mean what he symbolizes is easy to understand. So similar to Cars, I've had a rough time understanding what Diavolo was trying to symbolize for a long while now, and I think I've come to a pretty good understanding of what he was trying to symbolize during the events of part 5, those being the fallacy of the everlasting climax and learning how to lose. Ever since the burning of his village by his own hands and the splitting of his mind between Doppio and Diavolo, Diavolo's obsession is to gain power, to gain an everlasting climax. This is primarily done, other than gang activities, through king King Crimson. Now, King Crimson's stand ability is highly complex to talk about, but for the sake of argument here, King Crimson skips over the undesirable events in life for the desirable ones, meaning that Diavolo never loses. He only ever wins because, well, he skips over his losses or potential losses in life, giving him this warped perception of reality that he can only ever continue to gain and gain and gain, leading to the philosophy of him having the everlasting climax into, well, death or infinity itself. However, somebody forgot to tell Diavolo the idea of a climax is the peak of something, meaning there is going to be a fall off, which does clearly happen within part 5 through Giorno and Gold Experience Requiem, becoming the new boss and gaining undescribable amounts of power thanks to the Requiem. The reality of the situation is simply as follows. Climaxes happen and they go, and sometimes you hit rock bottom. That's perfectly okay. If we actually look at the history of the author of the manga itself, it has taken Araki a very long time to get to the point where he's at right now. And eventually there will be a point where the climax ends. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. That's the natural order of things in this universe, in this world. Avoiding it is just going to make it worse. And when you're at the bottom and you try to learn from it, you will grow from it and possibly reach a new climax. If you actually do some parallels between Diavolo and Giorno, Giorno experiences a lot of loss in his life. But what he does with those losses is what defines his character. And what he does with that definition is becomes the new gang leader of the mafia, establishing a better climax after a series of losses. Easy to say, hard to master, and coming from a YouTuber, you learn how to live with your losses. Trust me. I hope you didn't forget about Dio, because now we gotta deal with Pucci. So what happens when a 100-year-old plus vampire with a power issue and some clear, terrifying fears that makes him want to control all of fate meets a young man who can be easily influenced? You get Enrico Pucci. Now, shockingly, I think Enrico Pucci, or just Pucci for short, is extremely easy to understand. Pucci symbolizes the idea that blind faith is, well, incredibly bad. Now, I don't mean faith as in Catholicism, I mean faith in anything in general. That's because when his sister died because of his own mistakes, Dio's influence was able to encroach on Pucci, and it was all downhill from there. Pucci, being the false prophet that he was, put Dio on the same pedestal as he did for God, and over time tried to enact the Heaven Plan. It took years, but eventually he was successful, and we came to learn that the Heaven Plan is a very odd one. It forces people to realize their fates. In doing so, it would either collapse some people or bring people to a new enlightened state, but gave Dio and Pucci the ability to manipulate fate by removing people from the timeline, or potentially, because they never ended up doing that because Pucci died before he could do any of that thanks to Emporio. Now, if you find this plan insane or pretty contradictory to what Pucci was doing as a priest, you would be correct. It makes literally no sense if you think about it for a few seconds. And that's not me saying it, that's Araki also saying it. Araki believes this blind faith is so bad, and never questioning it makes Pucci the ultimate evil, or the supposed ultimate evil within the original universe, parts 1 through 6. And that's not even getting into the religious aspect of things, making Pucci a antichrist or a false prophet like figure. I cover that in a different video. Araki plainly makes it obvious that Pucci is supposed to be a really bad guy. You shouldn't blindly follow other people's opinions or objectives without really questioning them, or people who forget about their ideals or where they came from. And to put my money where my mouth is, even question me. Sometimes I get interpretations wrong or facts wrong. Never blindly listen to anybody. Always question everything. It's a really good ability to have in this day and age. So with the old universe covered, let's go into the new one. Funny Valentine, the opposite to Pucci. While one is questioning religion, the other is questioning politics. Funny Valentine is clearly a character who only selfishly agrees with the United States. This is something I've covered in a different video. Pretty good one at that, I would say. Unlike part 6, which just gives it to you, explaining why Pucci is the ultimate evil, part 7 makes you work for it to understand why Valentine does the actions that he does. President Funny Valentine is an American nationalist who will sacrifice the lives of Americans and other citizens around the world in order to guarantee the fortune of a future American empire where no misfortune can happen to the country. In order to achieve this goal, Valentine lies, cheats, steals, kills a hell of a lot of people in order to achieve the dream and acquire the holy corpse of Jesus Christ to give the country the blessing of fortune. However, though, in direct opposition, Jesus Christ, the ultimate good within the SBR universe, does not want his holy corpse in the hands of Funny Valentine, and by any means necessary, Johnny Joestar is supposed to retrieve it out of the hands of Funny Valentine. If it's not obvious compared to Pucci, Funny Valentine is a really, really bad person. He's also one of the few main villains to have a very specific scene with Lucy that I will not show to emphasize that he is a evil, evil man. The symbolism is quite simple to understand here. Do not trust a politician for shit. Question all authority, no matter where it comes from. It's also kind of ironic that Araki does this back to back with both religion and politics. Remember, question everything. Now, coming around to part 8, Jojolion, and talking about its main villain, Toru. Toru can be broken down to symbolize a few things. A little bit of feminism here, a little bit of critique on the medical industry, and maybe a critique about men. And in specific, lonely men who are dangerous to society. And speaking more about that one in specific, it is very clearly obvious, at least to me, and I think a few fans in the JoJo community, that Toru is a lonely individual, which is a rock human trait that almost all of them throughout the manga show very adamantly. And the ones that aren't lonely, well, statistically speaking, coming from Araki's mouth himself, don't end very well. We can say honestly there is only one good rock-human relationship in the story, and it ends by calamity. Toru is the type of character to prey on the people that don't know or are too weak to defend themselves. His prime target being Yasuho. Now, I don't see a lot of people talk about her character very often, but Yasuho is a woman that has dealt with a lot of things in her life. Suicidal thoughts, an abusive household, and some very suspicious stuff when she was very young, caused by Toru, only to end up in his hands some years later, with a man almost triple her age. Toru is not some 20-something. He's damn near 90, thanks to his rock human biology. There is a clear power imbalance in favor for one side of that relationship. And if you know anything about those type of relationships, it's not good for the weaker individual. But lucky for Yasuho, she's able to get out of that relationship with her life. Because rock human or regular human, it usually doesn't end well like that. So there's a little bit of girl power laid in between the lines. However, because me being a dude, I feel like I do have a limited perception on what Yasuho truly feels like here, so I think the women in the comments should probably give their take on this. I don't exactly know the full ramifications of that type of relationship and what it truly means, so I am going to need a little bit of help on speculation on that part. However though, when it comes to the medical industry and the Lokakaka that Toru is owning and distributing throughout Morio, this I definitely know. Toru is preying on the weak who have faced violent calamity towards their bodies, who in theory don't actually solve their problems, but just replace it with a different problem, thanks to the Lokakaka. And this is clearly a parallel to real life medical industries giving you one drug to solve one problem, but because of the side effect of the drug, give you a whole nother, then to actually sell you the cure for a fuck ton of money. I genuinely think by the end of Jojolion, at bare minimum, Araki is trying to symbolize how messed up the medical industry around the world is. And I'm kind of mad that it took me this long to realize. And this one being a low-hanging fruit, Toru symbolizing the idea of calamity, while Josuke symbolizing the idea of a miracle. While tragedy can affect anybody around the world, you also have to simultaneously remember that miracles also happen around the world just as much. And when the two clash, of course the miracle is going to beat the calamity. Toru symbolizes a lot of things, and I can't really necessarily choose one over the other. I think all of them are almost near equally valid. Might explain why people don't like him, because maybe he's symbolizing too much all at the same time. Just a food for thought there. Which brings us to the end. So what do all the villains of JoJo symbolize? I think there is a lot of overlap here to look at. Araki, for the most part, clearly has a type of villain, a villain that he wants to talk about or describe about for the most part, that being characters who crave power or want to want, being your Dios and your Cars. Then your villains who symbolize very specific critiques about humanity, that being Toru, Funny Valentine, or Pucci, with the rest being a deeper look at the darker psychology of humanity, that being Kira and Diavolo, people who are obsessed with physical and immaterial things in this world, with all of them overlapping each other in some kind of way. And when these villains are looked at as a whole, I think Araki is presenting a group of people with clear net negatives to society, who when foiled up against the heroes, show what is so great about humanity. The goodness, the justice, the wanting to care for other people, being selfish for your own growth for the positive, and reconnecting with your humanity, or finding a better place somewhere else down the line. Because it wouldn't be a celebration of humanity if you didn't show all of it, the good and the bad, the absolute worst versus the absolute best. It's a pretty awesome core factor of a franchise if you ask me. So with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, consider supporting the Patreon if you like my content, stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.